Hi everyone, my name's Ray. Thanks for having me. This is my first time coming to the Brussels office. I'm usually based in Antwerp, so thanks very much for listening to me talk about my topic today, value orchestration. Now, just a raise of hands maybe to begin with. Who's heard of this term before? Okay, cool, nobody? Who is a UX designer? Most of you, makes sense. UI designer? Cool. Researchers? Yes, there's a few, excellent. And product owners? One, one or two. Okay, excellent. I'm catering to the right audience. So a little bit about me before we get started. I've worked across most of those roles that I mentioned just before in research, UX, and also in service design. A little bit about me. On the weekend, I was at Full Circle Antwerp, so enjoying a little bit of the electronic music, bouldering, cycling as my life outside of work. I feel like there's a certain trifecta for design people that it's always something to do with these hobbies, but I tend to meet a lot of people that have the same ones. Yeah, maybe a few of you. But here today we're going to talk about perhaps one of the most boring topics that I can think of in relation to design. So I'll do my best to make it interesting, but I think it's actually very interesting for myself, and it comes from a question of, well, how do I start to incorporate financial thinking, viability thinking into my design process? That's the main question that I'm trying to address today. So what is value orchestration? The way that I try to frame it is it's a more rigorous way to articulate business value at scale. And it can be worked with and adjacent to design research and to product design. So what does that mean exactly? When I think of value orchestration, you might have worked with BAs before, you might have worked with financial analysts before. The way that I like to think about it is it's kind of like the next generation of that. We're going too far. So the main premise behind value orchestration is that it's business value rooted in the individual actions of a user, of behavior, in terms of process, in terms of what they're doing, thinking, saying, and actually being able to articulate value at that micro or step scale. And if you think about it from a UX perspective, it's if I'm clicking on this form, or if I'm interacting with this feature, or if I want to schedule something or book an appointment, it's that kind of micro level. And from there, you actually try and bubble that all up, all these different micro interactions, to get to a financial number. Now, I'll ask a little bit about the name, like why is it value orchestration, not financial analysis, since I keep making that comparison. Well, it's not finance because we like to think of value as more than just dollars. It's something that means different things to different people, to different roles. What might be a financial saving might be a time saving, might be less friction, might be more satisfaction. And it really depends on what's happening at each micro step of your users, employees, customers. So that's that first word. And the second word, rather than analysis, we use orchestration. The reason being is it is the planning and coordination of multiple elements to achieve an outcome, rather than just necessarily one product or one feature. So it's stitching all of these different aspects or areas or features or processes together into one experience, into one business outcome. It's not performed in isolation. Now, this comes from originally some of the big consulting firms. That's also where I come from in terms of my career. I used to work at EY and IBM Australia. I'm an Australian expat, if you can't tell by the accent. The main reason why this has come about is for that main point up the top. It's at scale. So working within enterprise transformations, experience transformations, digital transformations, this is the context at where this type of field or emerging discipline has come from. And this talk is about my interpretation of that as a designer and how I can start to use this skill set within my own design process. So hopefully this will be useful for most of you here. Okay. So this is the question I'm answering. How might value orchestration be used to guide and inform the design process of a researcher, UXer, or service designer? Okay, so how does it work? When and how would you use it? How does it help? And specifically, how does it relate to the design method? I'll use the double diamond just for brevity or familiarity. Within the research capacity, the design capacity, and that sits within digital products, but also within services. Okay, so I always like to start, I'm a very analytical person, so I think in terms of black boxes and step-by-step approaches. I usually go from inputs and outputs. That's how I'll describe it to begin with. So what do we put in? Data. Finance, tool data or product analytics data, internal roles, so that might be people's salaries, that might be the number of hours that someone's working on something, it might be how many minutes a user spends on a particular application. It's all that kind of stuff. You look at, within an organization, coming from an enterprise context, what are your baselines? So what are your current state? How much does it cost to perform customer help and support? How much does it cost to go through conversions or to go through signups? What are the net costs in terms of CapEx and OpEx that an organization has to deliver in order to achieve that particular level of performance? So looking at your costs, but also looking at your benefits. You also now get into more of the researchy, designy side of things, so things like pain point, frictions, impact assessment, so talking a little bit about change there. This is where you might be working with a researcher more clearly to say, hey, can you tell me about what your users or your customer segments are doing at this part of the process? I need that data as well to perform alongside these other two things. And lastly, existing market research and trends. So this is looking externally outside of your own processes, trying to get, coming from my systems perspective there, all of these things wrapped together to say, okay, this is what we're working with. This is the current baseline that we have achieved of a business. So then we move to the work, the thinking, the process, what actually value orchestration is. There are two things that I'm going to go through with you today. Something called a hypothesis register. Does anyone know or have heard of one of those before? Has anyone heard of a research plan? Couple of nods, couple of yeses. So research plan, basically a hypothesis register is something that's connected to a research plan. It's something that researchers generally can make, which then they hand over as a completed artifact to your designer. Something that's specifically related to VO towards that financial analysis skill set is also something called value trees and value drivers, and I'll also explain what those are as well. Those might be the most unfamiliar concepts, so I'll work my way up to that. So from going through your VO work using these tools, you then get to an output of, okay, well, what is the point of us going through all of this? So if we think of it as a next generation BA or next generation financial analysis, you're asking questions of how can I articulate return on investment? How can I make an estimate of an opportunity cost? What is like a roadmap of my particular feature or product backlog, and when should I release what? These are the types of outcome that with VO work you can achieve to a higher level of confidence. You can have estimates with a lower margin of error, so that you can say, hey, we need to build this product, we need to release this feature now, we need to optimize this process in this way. So you basically can come up to your stakeholders or to your sponsors and say, we need to create this particular feature, this product, this service, and we know that it will achieve this much gain at this much cost with confidence. Cool. Next up, we have an example case study. So I'll actually go through now a scenario over the next 5 to 10 minutes, we'll see how we go, of taking an example company, an example case study, using value orchestration as a skill set alongside your typical design process. So let's start with this prompt. We start, actually this is a real scenario that I've heard recently in my work. It's obviously sanitized, but I'll start with the misguided business goal that you might typically get from a sponsor, from a client, right? We want 1 in 4 Australians, Belgians to use our app once a month, okay? Now, as a metric or as a measure, I don't really like that all that much. It doesn't necessarily articulate value. It doesn't say what is the organization getting a few nods here. So we actually use something called a business opportunity statement. You might have heard of a problem statement or a problem hypothesis. How might we statement, buzzwords, to basically reframe this challenge into something that's a little bit more tangible. How might we deliver an excellent and convenient app experience for current and prospective customers so that they can digitally self-serve in order to reduce customer service costs by 30%? So it's an example of maybe going through like a SMART goal exercise. You can see there's some numbers, it's tangible. Okay, now I actually know what it is that I need to achieve in a little bit more detail. So let's take this example company, ABC, trying to improve their customer service costs. Okay. I am now a design researcher. I'm going to use my value orchestration skill set, working with maybe a few others of my project team to try and achieve this outcome. So, step 1. Who's heard of a hypothesis? Or used a hypothesis before? Yeah. Is that all the researchers, basically? Yep. Cool. The hypothesis format, for those who don't know, the designers will get to your part in a bit, is to actually frame in a more scientific, more clear, again, more practical way, what is the premise that we're trying to achieve? Given X, a particular premise, a current state, fact, if Y occurs, so if an action occurs, then Z, an outcome, will be performed. We follow that format, we can achieve that at different scales, and what happens here is we use a hypothesis to try and frame back to that original question. So that's what a researcher might typically start with. Let's give it an example. So here's a problem hypothesis. Given that 70% of customers at company ABC call our helpline, we want to effectively introduce web chat so that we can reduce calls by 50%. Clearly there's a business outcome, hopefully that can help us with our customer service costs of 30%. Okay, makes sense? Notice here that I've qualified this by saying it's a problem hypothesis. As researchers, we typically look at the problem or the opportunity, but there is also another kind of hypothesis, at least how I've learned, which is a solution hypothesis. This reframes it slightly. They're almost like two sides of the same coin. In one side, you look at a problem, in the other side, you look at the solution. The hypothesis of a solution is equally important to the problem because not only have you now correctly identified the problem, you also need to know if the solution will work to fix it. So I'm going to start with this as an idea to say, all right, if a new web chat is implemented well, if customers adopt the web chat, then we can still achieve the same outcome. So that's kind of the link between a problem and solution hypothesis. The outcome stays the same. But the difference is, here's the problem, here's the solution. Okay. We've got hypotheses down. Now it's going to get a bit more complicated. Bear with me. So highlighted there in the yellow is the example problem hypothesis that I've created. This is where this scale factor comes in and where value orchestration starts to play a little bit of a part. So me as a researcher, I'm still going through and writing a whole bunch of hypotheses, interrogating and trying to understand the problem statement. Maybe I'm doing some desktop research, exploratory research, interviews, focus groups. We'll see how we go. But as I'm going through all that process, I still have ideas of, well, where is the opportunity exactly? That's my researcher nose trying to find the answer. I then start to create a register of all of these hypotheses together. So a few of them are stuff about email, stuff about maybe dispute handling, maybe views to the FAQ, maybe something about appointment scheduling. It's all to do with that original premise of I want to reduce customer service costs, but you're actually looking quite broadly. You're looking at multiple channels, different types of interaction, scheduling processes, even just digital communications. But in each instance, you actually have outcomes that are all the same. So reduction of calls, average resolution time, FAQs or calls related to those FAQs might drop. It's taking that systems or that service view towards the different ways that an organization can respond and help with your customer service, right? It's a simple example because hopefully it's a bit relatable. You can imagine if you're trying to contact your energy provider or your insurance, you can always imagine yourself trying to go through these processes, yeah? So as a researcher, I've now created my hypothesis register. And you're thinking, okay, well, where does the value orchestration come in? So now what I'm going to start to do is I'm going to start to map something a little bit more tangible, a little bit more quantitative, which is about connecting those hypotheses on an individual level to KPIs and something called value drivers. Now, KPIs generally make sense. You can see some examples there. Number of emails, response time of a call, number of appointments, maybe it might be your process speed or it might be your number of cancellations. They're your indicators leading and lagging to say, we're doing this well, we're doing this not so well. Value drivers are something that become a bit more abstract but are crucial for our next step. So you think about your KPIs, you need to now create a link from your KPIs to your business benefits or your business outcomes. In other ways, the things that the business cares about in terms of cost, in terms of finance. So things like cost to serve, customer satisfaction, cost of labor, cost of CapEx, so things like investing in a tool or a platform or a process. Basically anything that's to do with money that you can put into a bucket. If you ever worked with a program sponsor or somebody who has a certain budget, they'll have different things that they want to dedicate their budget to. Those things on the right are typically the categories that you would see. So by creating this kind of structure here, we can actually line up the experience of a customer and of a user by channel. So this is the thing that they're doing by email, by appointments, by phone call, so on and so forth, and then linking all of those interactions to your benefits in a structured, rigorous way. Now, the point of us going through all of this work, still in our research phase, is to start to create something called a value tree. So here are those categories that I've called out earlier for value drivers. And what the person who's practicing value orchestration does is they actually start to create something called that value tree. Now, this is where you now start to connect or theme things into certain financial categories. So here you can see I've just created a very rudimentary view. Any actual person who's doing this rigorously will say, oh, that's not quite right. But the idea here is to put it into a couple of categories. You've got operating expenses, CapEx, and then you've got discrete categories. So on the top, you might have things like salary, things like ongoing expenses of labor. Underneath that, you've got things like customer satisfaction, customer ease of use. Below that, you have things like licensing, reputability, brand awareness, your external costs related to your upkeep or your image, and then sales and revenue, your typical business metrics. They're all discrete, different items, but they all still fall under OpEx. Okay. The main purpose of a value tree, coming back to our original hypothesis, our original how might we statement, is reduction of cost to serve, right? Reduction of those customer expenses. So in this instance, this particular value tree is all connected to that main business outcome. And this is really the value of value orchestration at scale. It allows you to create from a micro interaction level, from your emails, your phone calls, your particular step-by-step interactions with users and customers, and you create a link or a network all the way back up to your primary business metric. Okay, so how does it work, or how would you do this in practice as a designer, as a researcher? Here's the main 5 steps. You've got scoping, baselining, estimation of problems, estimation of solutions, and then road mapping. Now, the hypotheses that I talked to you about are steps 3 and 4, but we'll get to that when we get to that. We start, as in any given project, by setting your goals and strategies. This is more like precursor or just making sure you've got the hygiene right. Any project you start this way. The things that you need, though, in order to bring in that viability lens, to bring in that financial lens, are these items. So you'd actually be asking at the start of your project kickoff, give me data. Give me all kinds of data related to money. I've had multiple interactions and conversations with sponsors. Sometimes they've been really nice and they go, here you go, here are all the costs that we have related to customer service. Or the organization might be mature and say, yeah, for every phone call, it costs about €7. Nice. Other times I've had people say, why do you need our salary data? We're not firing anybody, go away. So you kind of have to pick and choose your battles and find that line of sensitivity of what data can you use, but the more the better is the principle here. From there, you go through baselining. So this is evaluating that current state performance. You might work with a business analyst, you might work with a financial analyst, or somebody maybe from your PMO to get this kind of stats or figures. And this is where, working within value orchestration, you create your artifacts of your value tree and your problem hypothesis. So your researcher might be working together with this role to create those artifacts. Then you go through your estimation steps. And this is actually, before we even get to the solution part, it's happening really early on in your design process, in your discover and your define stages. If you're familiar with your double diamond, your 4Ds, right? It's that first diamond. Here, you actually start to write your problem hypotheses, you start to develop your research findings, and you go through your research plan of interviews, focus groups, surveys, and so on. As you're going through that process, you're filling in the numbers and the figures. So you might hear from an employee, oh yes, we have a team of maybe 10 people, roughly we're spending this many hours on a problem or a particular process. You might hear from customers or users, oh, I don't like this part of the process, why did I have to schedule things? Or, here's another pain point, I really didn't like the cancellation fee that you had. But then you start to get a complete picture of what people like, what people don't like on the organizational side, outside in your users, customers, and market, and you start to create this balancing act. And that balancing act with numbers populated against those categories sits within your value tree. From there, we now move to the design element, which is where maybe the UX designers can go, oh, finally. But this is where now the researcher hands their work over to the designer and says, okay, we need a mock-up, concept, wireframe. All right, cool. But then as a designer, how do I know if the work's going to be good or not? Well, the trick is the researcher or the designer can then work to write solution hypotheses. So I'll give you an example related to that chatbot one that I used earlier. Maybe as a solution hypothesis, I could say, we want to effectively implement a chatbot, but to do so, we need to have really good handoffs within our app to our core hotline, and we need to have interactions that are less than 5 minutes or less than 3 minutes with maybe going back and forth in your conversation design of 2 or 3 steps. That's what will be an effective solution. So you write that into your solution hypothesis, and then you go off and design it. And then you come back to that original hypothesis with the KPIs, and you test it. And you say, are we actually saving money this way? Did it reduce the amount of time of our call center staff? Did it help direct or triage the customer to the right place? Are they more satisfied now? Are we getting more thumbs up rather than thumbs down from that interaction? So you're actually starting to measure, using that Excel sheet thing that I was showing you earlier, by each micro interaction, oh, with the solution, I now have a number connected to that. And that number comes from the due diligence and the hard work of your BA, financial analyst, researcher that happens before then. You might have heard as a designer going through constraint-driven design or viability-constrained design. In that sense, you kind of recognize what's worth building, what's worth putting a lot of effort in, and what's not. This gives you a little bit more of grounding, a little bit more evidence to say, yes, I have confidence that this is the thing that I should build. So lastly, you come back, maybe you've tested your mock-up, your mid-fidelity, high-fidelity prototypes, you're ready to start releasing it, but you still want to kind of test or validate the solution as a whole. So at that stage, you come back to that value tree, you look at the features, you look at the associated cost to build of that feature, and then you look at the expected opportunity gain of that feature. How much money will this particular feature make, and how much will it cost to implement? And from that, you get return on investment per feature, per particular item within a product or service. That's what allows you to create your stronger business cases and what allows for stronger road mapping or prioritization as you're going quarter by quarter or project by project. So that's our value orchestration process. Here's a little bit of a diagram just mapping those 5 stages to something that may be a little bit more familiar. So on the top here we have IDEO's double diamond, your discover, define, design, deliver. Researchers and designers, you can kind of see where you'd be playing depending on the types of project. And those are your alignments to the type of activity that you'd be doing from a VO perspective that would support your step. Okay, when and why would you use VO? So it's useful in the following contexts: enterprise transformation, program management, startups and scale-ups actually like IO. This skill set is something that I'm coming and bringing in from my own experience, and now I'm just getting the word out there to see how people will like it and feel about it. The benefits: you can estimate opportunities better. I think I've described that reasonably well. You can validate concepts and solutions. So there's a clear point here between point 2 and 3. You can validate concepts and solutions at the idea phase or the opportunity phase, right? Only when you've actually researched, oh, this is perhaps something that we can investigate. Before even moving into design, you can already start applying VO. But then you can also validate growth. So maybe you've developed or released a product, it's already out there in the wild, but you want to release an update, or you want to see to what extent can you grow or scale a particular solution. You can go through the same process in that sense because you're really just measuring between your current state and your proposed future state. So that's the idea of basically creating a financial language that can allow you to better understand where you are and where you're going. Cool. Last thing to talk about here is like when or how is it being used or being practiced. So you'll probably find this skill set within these big consultancies, but it's really something that can be used in any context. And as long as you're perhaps one of these roles, this is the way that I think you would be able to use VO. So as a researcher, UX and service designer, I consider VO an adjacent skill set. It's something that you can learn or sort of put your breadth into if you think about your T-shape, which allows you to better consider viability, better consider constraints, to make sure that the work you're doing, you don't overextend, or you're not generating a bit of waste, making a few extra screens, or doing too much research that doesn't necessarily support your original hypothesis. And then for PMs, POs, and your more senior roles, it's really more to do with the structure of how they're going through PI planning, where they're putting investments in terms of being fiscally aware. You might have heard of like a department of marketing or a function that has overextended all their budget, or they have a few thousand euros still wanting to be used somehow. Or you might have heard of processes where strategy of an organization doesn't necessarily connect to what the individual teams are doing on the ground. That's usually a symptom of not having this type of rigor when it comes to your financial thinking or your financial maturity. Great. So in closing, VO, it's basically looking at your business performance, looking at your customer users' needs, going through the design process, plus that rigor that I've talked to you about, the structure of creating a value tree, creating value drivers to connect to those points of the design process. It can be adopted to estimate new opportunities and validate improvements. And you can learn and understand by anyone who wants to build financially stronger cases. Cool. So that's me. Connect with me on LinkedIn or look at my portfolio if you want. If you want to learn more about this, just type in the words. They're pretty buzzwordy, so you'll find a few hits. I learned this from IBM Garage at IBM, and they have a number of online courses and things that you can do to learn more. Thanks very much. Do we have question time?
I was going to say, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Questions? Anyone want to kick us off? I know I have a few on my list.
Yeah, I have one.
Here, I'm gonna hand you this one.
I think it's okay now.
Take it away.
Have you been able to verify the gains you estimated in the research phase in the live environment?
Yes. That's the purpose of this skill set. It allows you to articulate return on investment before you even create or deliver something. You present that to your PMO and to your investment board. You go off and then build the thing, and then the whole point or the whole value of VO is you then say, okay, well, now we've delivered a thing. Let's look back and see if the estimation was accurate. You then mark the difference. You see, to what margin of error you had, and you repeat the cycle. Right? So that gives you a follow-through rather than maybe the typical symptom of an organization saying, oh, we want AI, or we want this thing or that thing. They go off and build it, but then you've completely forgotten about what the point of it was or to what extent or what outcomes they were trying to measure. This links it back very clearly.
Other questions? Oh, here. I'll hand the mic down here. Sound good? I'll make it a team effort.
Thanks. Hi. How does this relate to the concept of growth hacking? And could you talk a little bit about quantifying more nebulous metrics like pain points?
Yes.
And how they lead to the concrete numbers at the end?
Yes, great questions. I'll do my best to answer them step by step. With VO, the easy part is obviously with metrics that are already defined or standards that are already defined. So customer effort scores or NPS, or you might be using Nielsen's heuristics. These are things that you can turn from qualitative data into quantitative data. But for things that are mostly qualitative, so you might have an interview with a customer and they're talking like, I don't feel like I belong to this organization, or my brand loyalty isn't strong. You might try to ask that question, how do you measure that? That's the challenge, I think, of the researcher. And it's also the challenge of trying to turn qualitative metrics, emotional metrics, human metrics into things that you can measure in terms of business value. Those links of cause and effect are not always clear. You basically have to do the best crack that you can. A lot of people use this skill set and then come up with different metrics to try and figure that out. Usually there is one answer of some form for things like complex problems, not wicked problems. Once you start to lose the connection of cause and effect, it no longer applies. But in that sense, it's really about giving the best crack of going through this rigorous process to try and find answers there. And then as you go through a process step before and after, a company gets better and more mature at being able to translate emotion and feelings into things that actually return on business benefits.
So just try a bunch of stuff until it works.
Exactly, yeah.
Anyone else? So I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about just the response that you get to implementing this kind of approach.
Yeah.
And especially how people perceive on both kind of the design side and maybe even the financial side, shifting that concept of value from strictly looking at numbers to that broader perspective that I think opens it up to a more kind of creative conversation.
So two parts. First is about selling it. Second
Yeah.
is about how do you advocate and sort of use it across your practitioners. So selling it is hard, first of all. It's something that for enterprises, a lot of organizations I've worked with, at least within consulting, they don't know it or they haven't heard of it. It's still something that's fairly new. making those connections or relationships to, oh, it's like advanced or souped up BA, or it's additional financial analysis on top of the design process we're already doing, is one way to put it in the door or start the conversations about it. Other ways is that you kind of just start doing it. So you just practice it within your design teams or as an individual practitioner, and that gives you constraints that you've set for yourself, which, at least for me, analytical person here, enjoy the structure and sort of those guardrails that allow you to stay within your design process. When it comes to advocating within your teams and to your peers and colleagues, really it's just conversations like this. It's putting the word out there, having conversations about it, seeing if it would be useful, and allowing you to interpret it and adopt the skill set for your relevant context, whether that's a freelancer, individual project, portfolio, or whole company. So, yeah.
Great. Well, as a PM here in Brussels, I'm very excited to continue talking to you about it.
Cool.
All right. Any final call for questions before we break? All right. Well, with that, we will take a quick break. Please crack a beer, have another snack, come speak to the speaker individually if you'd like. And then we will recommence at 8 o'clock for our next set of talks. One quick note that I forgot to mention earlier, for those who are interested, we are doing a workshop, I believe, in about a week through next Tuesday. So if you check our meetup page, where we are most active, there are still spots available. Those will probably go fast, but if you're interested, I strongly suggest you check it out while they're still free. All right, let's recommence in 15 minutes.